And so, oh, I get applause. I made it. I didn't die. All right. Yeah. Toby joked and told me that he was getting me a bottle of pain pills. So he still hasn't given them to me, so I think he's hoarding them for himself. And so, something I've always looked forward to, you know? So, yep, man, just counting them down. So, tonight, this is the first time that this has happened to me. But I was thinking about, I wanted to teach on a passage. We were talking about the humility of Christ, displayed in him being willing to come and suffer. So I wanted to speak on a passage that talked about humility, and as I was, and what it looks like in our lives. And as I was getting ready just a few minutes ago, like 2 minutes ago, I pulled up the passage that I planned on talking on, and then it dawned on me, I'm pretty sure I've talked on this on a Wednesday night to talk about humility. And so it may be the same passage, and you may not remember, but I do. And so we're going to go for it again, and maybe it's got a little bit different flair, just in light of what we talked about. But it's from Romans chapter 12. I think that Bo preached one Sunday on 12:1 and 2. And I think I followed him up and preached on 3. Romans chapter 12, verse 3. For by the grace given to me, I tell everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he should think. Instead, think sensibly, as God has distributed a measure of faith to each one. So this passage, I wanted to look at what does humility actually look like in our lives. I wanted to look at as Christ is the example, resisting pride, not insisting on us honoring him as he rightly deserved, instead of being willing to humble himself. I think there are some ways that we as a culture both rightly understand what humility should look like. We also have things that we, I think, miss the mark on as a culture. I think that there's some right things, like we recognize that proud people are not typically headed for much relational success. Proud people typically, they may be very successful in their businesses and making money. They may be able to climb the ranks. People may be dispensable to them. They may be people who are able to get a lot done because they find their value from what they're able to accomplish in their jobs, and so they're really driven people. There's a lot of ways in which we see pride, and we recognize that may be good for certain situations, but I wouldn't want to be married to them. I wouldn't want to be in any sort of friendship where I had to really trust them or trust and lean on them. I wouldn't want to devote years and years of my life to fostering a relationship with them, because they may at some moment realize that I don't offer them much anymore, and they, cut me to the wayside. So we get that. We get like there are negative components to pride. But I don't think that we oftentimes get what the inverse of it's supposed to be in our lives. Typically, when I see us as a culture, when we want someone to not be proud, what we often try to or think that they should look like is not actually humility. We often think they should be self-deprecating. Like they should be someone that thinks so little of themselves. Like a proud person could never say anything positive about themselves. The writer of the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Moses, he doesn't really fit that mold because I can't remember if I think it was Exodus. It's either Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, somewhere in there. Somewhere in that range. After Moses makes an appearance in the books that he's writing about himself, he writes, and Moses was the meekest man on the face of the earth. kind of our American paradigm of what humility is supposed to look like, what meekness is supposed to look like, would say that you can't write that about yourself and still be the humblest person on the face of the earth. So maybe he was up until that point and then like fell off. Numbers 12, verse 3 for anyone wanting to know. So my wife wanted to know. But being humble, we often think of as being self-deprecating. And I think that there is always value when we kind of course correct and say, okay, well, what does God expect of us? When he tells us to humble ourselves, not to be proud, but to be humble, what does he actually expect of us? This verse is actually a really good guide for it. It says, by the grace given to me, I tell everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he should, instead think sensibly, as God has distributed a measure of faith to each one. The first thing we see there is, I tell everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he should, instead think sensibly. So thinking of yourself more than you should is pride. You're putting yourself on a pedestal. You think, I'm doing greater things than anyone around me. I am better than others in some way. I do things that no one else can do. I'm indispensable, can't be replaced. Those are all the types of thoughts that happen, whether you're putting those exact words to it, that goes on in our inner being when we're filled with pride. We think that if we disappeared, the world, or at least the people in our sphere that we impact, would all of a sudden come crashing to a stop. This is not to say that we are not valuable, but humanity has had a long history of people leaving, moving, passing away. And while it does cause a lot of times a lot of hurt and difficulty, the world didn't stop spinning. So there are things that are prideful ways that we think about ourselves, like we are indispensable to all of those around us. We are indispensable to the communities that we are in. We're indispensable to our jobs. And there are certainly losses that happen if we were not there, but pride is thinking of ourselves in a way that's beyond what is actually true about us. It can also just be thinking more of our giftings, thinking more of our abilities, thinking more of us, and where we are. If we disappear, like, for example, take me in my position. If I left Gentian, all of a sudden that Gentian's going to fall apart and not being able to do the mission that God has for it. That would be proud. Because the reality is that God may be using me for a time, but he doesn't need me to accomplish that mission ultimately. So, think sensibly about yourself. Now, when we think sensibly about ourselves, we're really good at seeing this in other people. Like you think about your spouse or someone that you care about deeply, and they're struggling with like valuing themselves. They're talking about, I'm just worthless. I can't do anything right. I keep failing at this. They go on with this list of things about themselves. You know that that's not true about them, that they're far more valuable than what they're saying about themselves, that their estimation of what they actually contribute is far less than what they actually are contributing. For me, I know that when I hear Rebecca, if she ever has thoughts and struggles about that and starts questioning what she's doing and how much it's worth, it bothers me. Because I recognize this is not her thinking sensibly about herself. This is her self-deprecating herself. She's thinking that she doesn't contribute anything, that there's no value to what she's doing, that nobody would even notice if she were to disappear. That's the opposite extreme. And what Paul is saying is think sensibly. Think sensibly about yourself as God has distributed. And this is where, when we think sensibly about ourselves, one of the kind of guardrails that helps protect us from going to being proud is to actually recognize that when we're thinking sensibly about ourselves, everything that we have was given to us, distributed to us by God. It wasn't something that originated with you or me. Like, none of you were, before you were born, in your mother's womb, writing your DNA code. You were born with it given to you without you doing anything to contribute to it. None of us chose the natural giftings we were going to have. None of us chose the families who were going to enable us to do certain things, the friends who would provide us with opportunities, the jobs that would be opened up to us at just the right times for us to receive training. Like, I think back onto my life, and I have been consistently mentored by very godly men almost my entire life. And none of them came into my life because I asked them to. Like, every one of them, God placed in my life at just the right times for me to meet them, to build relationships with them, and then to be shaped and mentored by them. Like, there's so much of our life that has allowed us to become who we are, that all of the things about us that truly are great, that God has designed us to do and to thrive in, we have to, something that protects us from becoming proud about those things to where we can think sensibly about them, which means that we think about them in the right way. Something that protects us from pride is realizing every one of those things was distributed to us by God. It was not something that we gained because we earned it. It's a gift. So we think sensibly about ourselves. We don't self-deprecate ourselves. We think rightly about ourselves. So if you're really good at painting, it is okay to admit, I'm really good at painting. And it's also okay to, and something that helps protect you from pride can be, like, God really made me interested to be someone interested in arts from a time I was a young kid, and he put parents in my life that paid for me to go to art classes, and he helped me to go to school and develop this as a talent. So I am really good at it, but it is like God allowed me to get to this point. Thinking about our giftings, thinking about our interests doesn't mean that we deprecate them. It means that we think rightly about them as gifts from God. We think sensibly about them as something distributed as a measure of faith to each one. Now, something that also protects us from pride is that last phrase, these are things that are distributed to each one. He draws the emphasis in on the individual at that point, but what we know immediately happens following this is he says, now we have many parts in one body. He goes to talking about how these are gifts that are given not for individuals to use to make much of themselves, but it's given for individuals to use to serve others. So we become specialists. We specialize into ways that God has made us and gifted us to work and to serve. We think rightly about those giftings. We don't blow them out of proportion and pretend like we're the greatest musical writer since Mozart because we can play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And we don't deprecate them and say, I can't do anything right. Instead, we think rightly about it as these are things God has given us to serve one another. He didn't give us these giftings to make much of ourselves. He gave us them to make much of him. Sometimes what this looks like is when someone comes up to you and says, wow, that was just incredible what you were doing. The appropriate response is, thank you. It's not trying to say, oh no, it's not that great, or like trying to depreciate it, because do you realize that God gave you those giftings and made you who he did so that you would glorify him? So if he gave you that gift, he placed all these mentors and people and opportunities in your life to train that gift so that you could do it excellently to bring him glory. And then someone comes to you and says, that looks awesome, or you did great there, and you're like, man, it kind of stinks. Do you realize the person you're insulting at that point is the God who trained you up to glorify him in that moment? Like, the giftings he's given you are to make much of him. The things that you do well are to point to him. And the humility, as we saw with Jesus, the way that he served and the way that he cared and the way that he did all of these things, when he stood in front of Pilate and Pilate starts saying, well, are you the king of the Jews? He doesn't deny it. He doesn't turn away. When people are saying, they're accusing him and they're trying, he goes back to what is real. He goes back to the truth about what his claims actually are. He goes back to that basis. He bases it in reality. He doesn't start saying, these grandiose things about himself. Well, he is very grandiose. But he doesn't start blowing it out of proportion in things that he didn't actually say or didn't come to do. He bases it in who he really is as a human being in front of him. He really is the Son of God. And him, as a human, admitting that, was not proud. Jesus says, I am gentle and humble. It wasn't him denying and becoming proud in that moment. It was him acknowledging the reality of who he was to people and glorifying God through it. So I say all of this as we seek to put away pride and we seek to put on humility in our relationships with one another. The way that we do it is not by diminishing what we actually can do and contribute as a member of the body of Christ, as a person in our community, as a friend, as a spouse, as a person dating someone, as a classmate, as an employee. We should strive to do these things excellently. Do them well. Do them in a way that exemplifies the way that God has designed us to function and the way that he's trained us to function, so that when we are given those opportunities, when we're put on the stage, when it all comes to bear, we can point people to Christ. We can honor him and bring him glory and honor through it. We're going to spend some time praying tonight. Does anybody need a prayer sheet? We all help pass these out. Thank you. We're going to spend some time. What we're going to do is we're going to pray through these prayer requests, and then afterwards Toby will come up and take our prayer requests again. The way that I want us to pray on this is for community, that we would understand that in isolation we will inevitably be filled with pride. One of those guardrails for staying in humility is being in community, that our giftings are given to serve one another, that we were never made to be independent, that we will see the beautiful way God has made us to depend on one another, and that we would trust God's plan and commit ourselves to those that God has brought around us, problems and all. If every time we see problems in the people around us, we try to peel away and run and tuck tail, it's because we think that they have more problems than us. It's ultimately pride starts getting it. They're too costly. We don't need their problems. We need to get away from them. The reality is we've got problems we bring as well. Care. That we would support and build up one another in such a way that even our criticisms would be known to come from love. That we would encourage each other in the ways that we see each other faithfully pursuing God. We can help to guide one another's correct understandings of each other when we do correctly use criticism and encouragement. When we do rightly speak to someone and say, hey, you really think that you should be leading worship on Sunday and singing, and you sound like Donald Duck. You don't need to be in that position. There are times that, maybe not saying it like that, I'm being a little bit, that is very critical. Don't say it like that. But maybe God has gifted you in different ways, there are times that we can use criticism to help us keep a level head about ways that God has actually gifted us. And then we can use encouragement to help people see ways that God has really blessed them and gifted them to serve. And that's a double-edged thing. If you're only ever critical, you're just helping people become self-deprecating. We've got to both encourage and critique, same way. And then humility, that God would give us clear eyes to see ourselves sensibly, neither taking credit for the gifts God distributed, nor diminishing them and robbing him of glory. And so I want us to partner up and spend time just praying through these three areas.